Welcome. Good afternoon. Welcome. We're studying Ethics of the Fathers, Chapter 2, Mishnah 8. And it features the teachings of one of the most pivotal figures in Jewish history, Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai. So I want to talk a little bit about Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai, because if not for his efforts, we certainly wouldn't be here today. And not only would we not be here, but there would be no Jewish people, and there would be no Jewish religion. There would be no Torah, and that would be the end of the world, because the Torah teaches us that God created the world with a purpose, and the purpose is for Torah and Israel. If there's no Torah and there's no Israel the people, then there's no world. So you could say that the whole universe, even the most distant galaxy, is here today because of Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai. So if you ever visit people in another galaxy and they ask you about what your belief system, tell them the reason why you exist is because of Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai. So who was this Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai, and when did he live? Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai lived before the destruction of the Second Temple, and lived through the destruction, and lived many years even after the destruction. And he was the leader of the Jewish people. In what way was he the leader? He was the spiritual leader. He was the head of the Sanhedrin, and his title that he carried for not all of his life, but part of it was Nasi, the president, the leader of the Jewish people who were under the domination of the Romans. So let me talk a little bit about what it says about him. He was one of Hillel's students, and he was the youngest or the smallest. It's not clear what that means. Was he the youngest or the least significant? But it turned out that he certainly ended up being the most significant of all of Hillel's students. Now, he lived through, as I said before, the destruction of the temple. And what did he do? What did he accomplish? He accomplished three things. And there's a story behind it. I told the story in another class. I'll repeat it now because it's a very important story. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai lived at a time when the Jewish people were splintered. Not like today where there's total unity. But the people were... The people were divided up into many different camps, religiously, politically. They didn't get along with each other, and one of the big disputes was about how do we deal with Rome? Should we accept Roman domination and pay our taxes and be grateful to them that they allow us to perform the rituals in the temple and that we can practice our religion, or perhaps we should rebel against them and bring an end to Roman domination and let the Jewish people be independent? Because you have to remember, after the first temple was destroyed, the Jewish people did not enjoy real independence until the story of Hanukkah, when they gained some type of independence from Greek domination. But that didn't last that long, because a while later the Romans took over, and it's a whole long story that it was the Jewish leadership that invited Rome into Israel, and then they took over completely and they clamped down and they were very tough. So there was a movement within the Jewish community to rebel against Rome. And these people who spearheaded that movement were called Biryonim, the real zealous ones, the rabble rousers, the ones who wanted a fight. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai did not support them. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was opposed. He felt we have to make accommodations with the Romans. The time was not ripe for the Jews to rebel and to bring Mashiach, and therefore we have to just, swallow the lack of independence for the sake of being allowed to practice our Judaism and have the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple, intact. Yes?
So this was also the time of Rabbi Akiva and Bar Kokhba?
No, that was much later. Rabbi Akiva was a student of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's student, so he was 2 generations later. And that things changed then. Rabbi Akiva was for rebellion, actually, but Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was not for the rebellion. And things got very difficult. What happened? There were 3 very wealthy Jewish members in Jerusalem who supplied Jerusalem with 21 years worth of food and drink and everything they needed, and wood, which is fuel, for 21 years. The Romans were besieging the city, and they couldn't penetrate the fortresses, they couldn't penetrate the walls. And they were there for 3 years, and they still couldn't penetrate. Rome was not going to stay there forever. You can't keep an army in one place forever. But the Biryonim wanted a fight. And they knew the Jews are not going to fight as long as they're secure, and as long as they have the walls, and as long as they have food and fuel, they're not going to fight. So what did they do, the Biryonim? They burnt down all the supplies of food and all the wood. Everything was burnt down, was destroyed. That would force the Jews into fighting. Of course, this was a terrible thing, a terrible tragedy. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai knew that he had to do something to make some type of accommodation with Rome. So he calls in his nephew. His nephew was the leader of the Biryonim. But at this point, he probably realized that it was a big mistake for them to do what they did. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, I have to go speak to the Roman general, Vespasian. I have to do something to save something, to salvage something. So he said, you're not going to get out of this city. There are guards that make sure that nobody leaves the city, because they knew that some people would try to make some type of reconciliation with Rome and work things out. And you'll never get out. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, then what should I do? I have to get out. He says, you should feign illness. Make believe that you're sick. And a few days later, make believe that you died. And the burial takes place. They don't bury people within the walls of Jerusalem. So they'll take your body out. They'll let you out. So sure enough, the rumor spread that the great rabbi passed away, and they bring his body to the gates of Jerusalem. And the Biryonim are standing there, and it says, what's this? They said, what's the rabbi who passed away? We don't believe it. Let's take a knife and stab it. So the head of the Biryonim says, you know what? It's not a good idea, because the Romans will see that the Jews have so little respect for their own rabbis that they're willing to disgrace the body of their own rabbi by stabbing him. That would look terrible. So let's shake the coffin and to see if he shouts or screams or something. So no, the word will get out that we treated the rabbi disrespectfully. So they let him out. As soon as he got out, he was brought to the general Vespasian, and he addressed the general as Your Majesty. And the general says, you know what you just did is a capital crime. You deserve the death penalty on 2 counts. Number one, I'm not the emperor, I'm not the Caesar, I'm just a general. And to call me Your Majesty, that's treason. And secondly, if you think I am the king, where were you until now? What did you wait for? So the Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said that I couldn't get out. He explained what happened, and he said, but how do I know? But I know that you must be the king, because God will never allow us to lose our temple in the hands of anyone else but a king. And sure enough, messengers came from Rome that Vespasian was now promoted. He was now the emperor. And he left, and he brought his son Titus in his place to do the dirty work of destroying the temple. But meanwhile, he was so impressed with Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai that he says, ask me for anything and I will grant it. So the rabbi asked for 3 things. What are the 3 things? He asked for the city of Yavna and its sages should not be massacred. The Sanhedrin was situated in the Beit HaMikdash, in the Holy Temple. But before the destruction of the temple, the Sanhedrin exiled to a city called Yavna. And that's where all the sages were. That's where all the teachers of Torah were. Don't destroy that city with its rabbis. Keep them alive. The second thing he asked, yes?
I'm just curious, is Yavna a current city in Israel?
Yeah.
Yes.
I didn't know.
I don't know if it's the exact same place that it was then, but it's probably in the general area. The second thing he asked for, the family of Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Gamliel was the Nasi at that time. He was the leader. He was a grandson of Hillel. Hillel, remember, we said this many times, Hillel had a son who was Rabbi Shimon, and Rabbi Shimon had a son, Rabbi Gamliel. And Rabbi Gamliel was the heir to the leadership of Hillel, who were all descendants of King David. So Rabbi Gamliel, don't murder the family of Rabbi Gamliel, so there should be leadership. The Jewish people should not lose their leadership. And the third thing was Rabbi Tzadok was a very saintly rabbi, and he was fasting for 40 years. He would eat nothing during the day. I guess he ate something at night, and he was emaciated, and that provide him with a doctor who can nurse him back to health. And he granted all those three things. And the Talmud asked, why didn't he ask for the Beit HaMikdash, for the temple? That's the most important thing. Why didn't he ask for Jerusalem? So one answer the Talmud gives is because he knew he wouldn't get that. That was too big of a prize. After 3 years of besieging the city, it was the Romans would be humiliated that they couldn't conquer Jerusalem and destroy the temple. So that he knew he wouldn't get. Then the Talmud says that quoting a biblical verse, sometimes when God has a plan, he causes wise people to act foolishly. If God's plan was that the temple should be destroyed, he wasn't going to let a rabbi get in the way of that by making the right request. Why these three things? So I don't know if it says it somewhere, but it probably does say it somewhere, because we learned in Ethics of the Fathers in the very beginning that the world stands on three things. Torah, the study of Torah. Avoda, service, which is prayer. Originally it were the sacrifices, but prayer takes the place of sacrifices. And acts of kindness. Well, Yavna was Torah. That was the center of Torah. All the knowledge of Torah was situated in Yavna and its sages. Prayer was Rabbi Tzadok. He was the master of prayer, praying for 40 years incessantly for the salvation of the Jewish people. And the Nasi, the leader, he was not just the spiritual leader, but he was also the one in charge of the well-being of all the Jewish people. He was the one who made sure that everyone has all the things that they need. That's acts of kindness. So he wanted to make sure, Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai, that the three pillars upon which the world stands should be intact. As long as they're intact, the Jewish people will survive. Now, Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai lived to the ripe old age of 120. And the Talmud says his life was divided into three sections. The first 40 years he was engaged in business. I'm sure he learned Torah as well, but he earned a living from being involved in business. The second 40 years he devoted himself totally to the study of Torah. At the age of 80 he got a job. At the age of 80 he became the teacher of Torah to the Jewish people. So all our youngsters here are all able to start life all over again at the age of 80 and beyond. Moses, the Talmud says, was the same thing. Moses, the first 40 years of his life, he was in Egypt. The next 40 years, he was in Midian. And the next 40 years, he was in the desert. So his life was divided into three segments of 40. Hillel also lived to the age of 120, and his life was divided into three. First 40 years he was in Babylonia, then he was in Israel studying, then he became the leader for the last 40 years. There was one other great sage who lived to the age of 120 that the Talmud mentions. Does anyone want to guess who it was? Rabbi Akiva. Actually, he died at the age of 120, but he didn't die a natural death. He was tortured to death by the Romans. So anyhow, these are the four great people: Moses, Hillel, Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai, and Rabbi Akiva, who lived to the age of 120. So he had you could say, a complete, a perfect life. Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai was held in very, very high esteem by Hillel, his teacher. Hillel called him Av L'Chachma, Av L'Dorot. He's the father to wisdom, and he's the father of generations. What that meant was that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was a brilliant scholar. He was a father of wisdom, but he was also responsible for future generations. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was filled with the knowledge of he knew everything. The Talmud says he even knew how to speak to animals. He knew how to converse with trees. He understood the language of nature. He was steeped in the teachings of Kabbalah, of mysticism. Now, not all Talmudic rabbis were study Jewish mysticism. It's only a select few. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was one of those. His knowledge was enormous, was encyclopedic. But he wasn't just someone who had great knowledge, he was also an activist. He was the leader of the Sanhedrin. So he was involved in the day-to-day goings-on of Jewish life. He was involved with teaching, of course. He would have a class right outside the Temple Mount, and because no structure could house the number of people that would come to hear his lectures. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, in addition to his knowledge, he was also a fighter. He fought against a lot of different breakaway groups. He fought against the Sadducees. The Talmud has several debates that he had with Sadducee leaders about interpretation of the Torah. He fought against the Brionim. He was very much against the ones who wanted to rebel against Rome. The time was not ripe. So he was a scholar. Most scholars are mild-mannered, and we hope so. Many of them will not get involved in political matters because they're into intellectual pursuits. But he was very much an activist and pursued whatever needs the Jewish people had to deal with. He dealt with it. There's a Talmud tells, but he was also very much devoted. After the destruction of the temple, he was devoted to the temple. That means he didn't think the temple is gone, that's the end of Jewish life. On one hand, I'll give you an example. There was a group of people who decided the temple is no longer here, there's no point in living, we can't kill ourselves, but we're not going to eat meat, we're not going to drink wine, we're going to punish ourselves. And he said that was wrong. He says, you have to go on living. He says, so what are you going to eat? They said, we'll eat bread. He said, how could you eat bread? Because bread was brought in the temple, and we no longer have the temple. The reason why they wouldn't eat meat is they said, we no longer have sacrifices. How could we have meat? We no longer have the libations of the wine. How could we drink wine? So he said, you can't drink water either, because they had libations of water. You can't eat bread, because they had bread as an offering. That means you can't eat anything if you take that approach. And he made them realize that, yes, the temple was destroyed, but life has to go on. We have to recapture Jewish life without the temple. And that's why Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai made sure that Jewish life would continue. But at the same time, he never lost his hope that the temple will be rebuilt. And he enacted certain laws to make sure that we always remember the temple. I'll give you one or two examples. On the holiday of Sukkot, we have a commandment to take the lulav, the palm branch with the etrog, the lemon-like fruit, the willows, and the myrtles. The Torah only requires that for one day, the first day of the holiday. In the Beit HaMikdash, they did it for 7 days. But if you were not in the Holy Temple, you only did it the first day of the holiday. After the temple was destroyed, he said, now we do it every day. Why every day? To remember the temple, to remember that in the temple they did it every day. Then there's a law that the Omer, there's a barley offering that would bring the second day of Passover. Before that was brought, you couldn't use any grains. Any new grain of that season cannot be used until they brought the barley offering. But once the temple was destroyed, there's no more barley offering. He still maintained you had to wait the whole day before you can eat new grain. But why? But there's no more barley offering. He says, I don't care. The temple will be built speedily, he said. And then I don't want people to think that they could just go eating new grain without waiting for the barley offering to be brought. In other words, he had such hope. On one hand, he was pragmatic. He knew there's no temple. We have to keep Judaism going. On the other hand, we can't forget the temple. We can't. And that's why to this day, Jews have this paradoxical approach to life. We have to live today as if there's no tomorrow, and we have to live today focusing and obsessed with tomorrow. How do we reconcile those two things? That's why we're Jewish. We could combine opposites. We could be mourning and grieving, and we could be dancing almost at the same time. Because that's what Jewish life is. Jewish life was always so difficult, and we were constantly being attacked, and yet Jews continued to have family. Look at what happened after the Holocaust. After the Holocaust, why would anyone who went through the Holocaust even consider getting married, starting a business? And yet they got married, they had children, they started businesses, and Holocaust survivors, I think by and large, I never did a statistical survey of it, but I would guess that there's more wealth in Holocaust survivors than there is in any other Jewish community, proportionate to their numbers per capita. So Holocaust survivors have more drive to continue with living. Now, there were some who were not able to cope with it. That's understandable. But what's not understandable, that's the marvel of Jewish life, is that Jews are able to bounce back. The resiliency is something that is unparalleled and unprecedented. So Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai was able to combine those two things. After the temple was destroyed, he became the Nasi, even though he was not a member of the family of the leaders. It was hereditary. Hillel and Hillel's son and Hillel's grandson and great-grandson. He was not a member of the family, but he was the one by default. He became the leader. But after a while, he gave it over to Rabbi Gamliel, who was in Yavna. So he then became the Nasi. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai moved to another town, and he started another academy where he lived. In other words, he wasn't retiring. He retired from the position of leadership because there was someone who was more appropriate for that position based on his ancestry, but he started a new academy in a new place. He never gave up. On his deathbed, they saw him crying. So they asked him, "Why are you crying?" And he says, "I don't know where I'm going. I don't know. You can go to two places. You can go to paradise. You can go to the place where it's pretty hot. Down the
Florida.
What?
Florida.
And I don't know where they're taking me." And the question is asked, of all people, he would be the last person to doubt that he was going to the wrong place. I mean, this man's life was so totally devoted to doing good, to saving the Jewish people, saving Judaism. There's no other person who's more deserving of a paradise than him. And yet, you don't find other great rabbis saying that on their deathbed. Maybe they said it, but there's no report of it. But here there's a report of it. But why is there such a emphasis that in his life he didn't know where he was going? So one of the answers given, the Rebbe gives this answer. He says, Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai never had an opportunity to introspect, to look into his own personality, because he was too busy doing good. He never had a moment. He never stopped learning Torah. He never stopped saving lives. He never stopped fighting for good, for justice, and for everything that's consistent with Judaism. And people who are activists are always doing good, never have a chance to pause and say, let me think about myself. His own identity didn't exist. Not just because he was humble, we'll see that as well, but because he was too busy focusing on helping others and doing good that he never had a chance to look into his own personality. The first opportunity he had to look into his own personality was on his deathbed. He was no longer active. And he says, I don't know, I never really know, I don't know how I am deep down. I'm sure deep down he was pretty good as well. But he didn't know because he never explored his inner soul. Because in order for a person to do the right things, you have to always introspect. That's what we have the month of Elul coming up. We have the Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. That's all about introspection. But if you're too busy, if you're the rabbi and you're busy preparing a sermon, you have no chance to think about yourself. They say that rabbis could never repent, because as soon as they find something that's inspirational, they say, oh, I have a good subject for my next sermon. They never apply it to themselves. And I heard this from a rabbi who said, and that is, I'm going to use this as well.
Was his father, Zakkai, noteworthy? Was he...
He probably was, but he's not famous. We don't know too much about him. I don't know anything about him, but his son was the one who made his father famous. Like Maimonides father was a great person, but who made his father famous? His son. The son made his father famous. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the point I'm trying to make is, I don't know if there's any other person whose life was so totally absorbed with doing good that he didn't even have a chance to take a breather to think about himself. Before he passed away, he said, leave a seat for Chizkiyahu. Chizkiyahu was one of the greatest Jewish kings. He lived about 100 years before the destruction of the first temple. And what was unique about him is that not only was he righteous, not all the kings were righteous, in fact most of them were not, but not only was he so righteous, but he was an activist in spreading the knowledge of Torah, that if you went anywhere from one side of Israel to the other, you would not find a child who was not well versed in the most intricate laws of purity and impurity. He made sure that the level of education was so high, it's unparalleled. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, leave a seat because King Chizkiyahu is coming to escort me to the next world. Why did he pick on Chizkiyahu? So commentators say, because he was just like Chizkiyahu. His whole life was devoted to spreading Torah to as far as he can go.
Maybe he was alluding to that was himself in the previous incarnation.
Maybe, that could be. The Talmud says about he never spoke idle talk, never walked 4 cubits without Torah and tefillin. No one ever came earlier to the house of study than he opened the doors of the synagogue in the morning. Here he's the respected, venerated rabbi, senior citizen. He's a man over 80 years old, and he would open the doors of the synagogue where the people came to study Torah. No one ever greeted him first. It never happened that he should be walking in the street and someone should say, good morning, hello, how are you? He would always greet people before they would get to him. No matter who it was, Jew, Gentile, he would greet everybody and made sure that he would never let a person pass without greeting.
Like Aaron, right? Like Aaron.
Right, and Hillel's teachings that we learned a few months ago was you have to love peace, pursue peace, and love everyone, and bring them close to the Torah. He was a living example of that teaching. He was a real disciple, not just by learning from him. But he was someone who really took Hillel's teachings seriously. So let's see what Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai has to say. It says he received the tradition from Hillel and Shammai. Now before I go into the text itself, in the first chapter, it went through all the generations from Moses down to Hillel and Shammai, and Hillel's successors. And then chapter 2 went down all the way to Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, who was a descendant of Hillel, and then Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi's son, Rabbi Gamliel. And then it starts again with Hillel. In chapter 2, it starts again with Hillel, and after Hillel, it goes straight to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. What does that tell us? That Hillel, there were 2 tracks of transmission of Torah. Torah was transmitted from one generation to another, and it split into 2 tracks. One track was the children, the descendants of Hillel. They became the leaders, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Gamliel, and so on. It was hereditary. It was a Davidic line going all the way back to King David. And that was one way in which they transmitted the values of Torah. And then Hillel also had another track through his students, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and through Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's students, who were Rabbi Eliezer, and we'll soon read about them, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua, and then their students, Rabbi Akiva, and then Rabbi Akiva's students, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Shimon, and then Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Meir's students, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, where it converged again. So in other words, there are 2 tracks, and if you think about it and analyze the teachings, I think we could come to the conclusion that the difference between the 2 tracks were that the first track was mostly about values, about commitments to Torah and mitzvahs. The second track was mostly about teachings of Torah. And that's why the focus in the last Mishnah we had of Hillel, he talks about that one should increase the study of Torah. And then this Mishnah picks up with those words about if you add more to Torah, if you increase Torah, you add more to life. So here on this point, Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai picks up, and he used to say, if you have learned much Torah, do not claim credit for yourself, because for such a purpose were you created. The next piece over here is actually another separate Mishnah in many versions. So we're only going to focus on this over here now. What is Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai saying? Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai is saying, you want to increase Torah? Great, wonderful. The more Torah you learn, the better you are. The more life you'll have. But it's important to know your attitude towards your ability to learn more Torah and to have more knowledge. It has to be with humility. If you think, I studied a lot of Torah, so therefore I'm the greatest, no one could be greater than me because I studied so much Torah, then the Torah becomes a negative force in your life. And you have no right to claim credit for the study of Torah. I'll soon explain why. Why can't you claim credit? In other words, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was saying, yes, you have to increase Torah, but you have to increase it with the right attitude. Not with the attitude is that, look how great, look how wonderful I am. Amongst Hasidim, they used to point out the faults of people who were arrogant Torah scholars. That was one of the things the Baal Shem Tov was criticized very much, because Baal Shem Tov extolled the virtue of simple Jews. He said that a simple Jew who serves God with sincerity is superior to the great scholars who are arrogant. And the scholars didn't like that. That was one of the reasons they opposed the Baal Shem Tov. So there are many stories that the Chassidim told about this. There's one story that happened not too long ago. When I say not too long ago, probably about 80, 90 years ago, or maybe 100 years ago. But this is a true story. There was a rabbi who was a great scholar. He got up to give his lecture, and in the crowd was a chassid who was a simple Jew, relatively simple. And he was nauseated by the ego of this rabbi. And where did it express itself? The rabbi was citing many different passages of the Talmud, and every time he would cite a passage, he would tell you the exact page. It's on page 57b, to show off how he knows everything. And this chassid couldn't take the ego that this rabbi was exhibiting. So he gets up there, he stands up, and he says, when the rabbi said 57b, he said, no, it's 58b. He had no notion of where it was. He just said it's 58b. And the rabbi gets up there and he says, no, it's 57b. And the chassid says, Rabbi, you could be off by a page. It's not so terrible. It's 58b, not 57b. So finally going back and forth, and the rabbi is getting really agitated that the guy put a pin in his bubble, in his balloon. Right. So they said, okay, let's bring the text of the Talmud and we'll look it up. So they bring the text, and the rabbi was right. So the chassid says, look, I was off by one page, no big deal. Now, to give equal time to the opposition, one of the non-Hasidic rabbis, who was a great man, was known as Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. He was the founder of what they call the Musar movement, and he was very much into negating ego. That was one of his things but he was a brilliant scholar, and once he was invited to deliver a Talmudic lecture in a certain community, and before the lecture he had to give all the references that he's going to cite in his talk. So let's say that's a common thing when you give a lecture. People are not studying the same subject, so you would give them the references, they would look it up, so they would be prepared, especially when it's a very involved lecture. So he submitted all the different references, let's say a dozen or so references. There was some wise guy in the synagogue who didn't like the rabbi, He says, I'm going to play a practical joke. And he wrote up totally different references. It had nothing to do with the subject that this rabbi was going to give a very learned lecture on. And he posted that one, ripped the other one. They used to hang it on the wall. He ripped off the original and he posted that one. The rabbi comes to give the lecture, and he looks at the note with all the references, and he looks and he says they're all different references. It had nothing to do with his subject that he was going to speak on. So he paused for a few minutes, I don't know how many minutes, and he got up there, and on the spot he delivered a brilliant lecture using those new references. So someone asked him, why did you wait 5 minutes? It took you 5 minutes. That's pretty good. 5 minutes to make up a new... He says, no, I wasn't making up a new lecture in those 5 minutes. I could have done it without that. But I was concerned that it might be serving my ego. So it took me 5 minutes to decide that I still should do it, because I have to teach these wise guys a lesson. That was the idea. So Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai is saying that you can't come to Torah with ego, and don't take credit. Now, why can't you take credit? So there are two reasons. You think you learned a lot. You think you learned so much. It's nothing compared to what there is to learn. One example given, if a fly touches the ocean, so he takes a little bit of the moisture away from the ocean, how much is the ocean missing? It's a joke. You think you learned so much, you mastered the whole Talmud, you still know very little. So what do you think? Why are you thinking of yourself as being so great? I'll have to confess one of my sins. When I was a student, I was visiting Montreal at a wedding, and the chief rabbi of Montreal, Rabbi Hirschsprung, was there, and I went over to him, and the first question he would ask I met him more than once, but the first question he asks you is, what are you learning now? He meant, what volume of the Talmud? So I told him what volume I was learning. I was 21 years old then, and it's a volume that general yeshiva students don't study. It's beyond the scope of the curriculum of yeshivas. So I was proud of myself. So I asked Rabbi Hirschsprung, how old were you when you studied this volume? And he looks at me, looks down at me, I can still see it. And he says, when I was 18, I knew the whole Talmud with Rashi and Tosfos commentary by heart, word for word. And I know that he was telling the truth, because at another occasion, I tested him. I didn't try to test him, but he asked me what I was learning, and I told him what I was learning. And he asked me which page was I up to. I told him which page. I'm glad I remembered. And then he rattled off that page by heart, word for word, faster than I could read it. Then he asked me, what else are you learning? And luckily I had another volume that I was learning. What page? And he rattled that off, word for word. And he was able to do that with the entire Talmud, which is more than the Encyclopedia Britannica, if it still exists. And with commentaries, word for word.
The question also becomes, why do you study? Do you study to learn for yourself, or do you study...
Right, are you studying so you could show off, or you're studying because it's God's Torah? So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was saying, don't take the Torah to be something that makes you better, greater in your own eyes. But number one, because it's infinite. What you know is very little. And Rabbi Hirschsprung would probably be the first one to say, I know very little. I may know the Talmud by heart, but compared to what there is to know and all the commentaries and all the depth of it, I know very little. But then there's another reason why a person shouldn't take credit for himself, for his knowledge. That's our job. If someone comes to work, has a 9-to-5 job, and comes and starts bragging, you know what? I was at my work from 9 to 5. What are you bragging about? That's your requirement. You have signed a contract that you're going to be there from 9 to 5. You can't leave even a minute early if you're faithful to your contract. So don't ask for people should praise you. Now nowadays things have changed, I think. Nowadays you have to praise people for any little thing that they do, because we're on a lower level. But ethics of the fathers is for people on a higher level. On a higher level, don't take credit for all the knowledge that you have. Don't take credit because, number one, there's very little that you really know compared to what there is to know. And number two, that's your job. We were created for this purpose.